We have breaking news tonight from the New York Times. As I said, the newspaper that Donald Trump likes to call the failing New York Times. It is the very same newspaper that Donald Trump repeatedly invites into the Oval Office for exclusive interviews when he is feeling most desperate about getting his message out there. The president knows that what he says to Fox News has no reach beyond Fox News, but he is obviously a lifetime believer in the power of the New York Times, as are most people who grow up in New York, as Donald Trump did. The Times exclusive report from the Oval Office tonight by Peter Baker and Maggie Haberman quotes the president saying that Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein has said the president is not a target of the Mueller investigation. Quote, he told the attorneys that I'm not a subject, I'm not a target. When asked if he is a target of federal prosecutors in New York City, the president said, I don't know about that. The president told the Times that he has given up on negotiations with Congress for his border wall, and he made it very clear in the interview that he fears Elizabeth Warren most as a presidential candidate. He did that by attacking Elizabeth Warren, using what the New York Times described as the president's, quote, favorite slur for Elizabeth Warren, and he praised the candidacy of Senator Kamala Harris. The Times notes that the president does not know how to pronounce her name. The president said, I would say the best opening so far would be Kamala Harris, a better crowd, better enthusiasm. That doesn't mean that the president would prefer to run against Kamala Harris. It simply means his number one priority right now is to hurt the Warren candidacy. Senator Harris will surely come in for her share of Trump attacks. That's the way Donald Trump did it last time. He picked the person he perceived to be the front runner in the Republican primaries, Republican candidate Jeb Bush, and he attacked him relentlessly until he drove down Jeb Bush's poll numbers, and then in sequence attacked every candidate left standing after Jeb Bush. The Times reports that the president said he had, quote, summoned his intelligence chiefs, including Dan Coats, the National Intelligence Director, and Gina Haspel, the CIA Director, to the White House because he had heard they contradicted his foreign policy during testimony to Congress this week. But that meeting actually made it look as if Chuck Schumer was in charge of White House scheduling. Because at this hour last night, we brought you what was then the breaking news, that the Senate Democratic leader Chuck Schumer sent a letter to Dan Coats, the Director of National Intelligence, urging him to have, quote, an immediate meeting with the president to educate him about the facts and raw intelligence underlying the intelligence community assessments. Chuck Schumer's letter came at the end of a day in which the president openly attacked and insulted all of the leaders of our intelligence agencies and everyone working in those agencies. In one tweet, he screamed, "They are wrong!" exclamation point. In another, the president said that people working in intelligence should go back to school. The president launched that attack the day after the heads of those agencies testified to the Senate and presented intelligence assessments that completely disagree with what President Trump has said about North Korea and Iran and ISIS. The president did not attack their testimony on the day that they gave that testimony. It was only after the president saw the news media reaction to the director's complete disagreement with the president that the president angrily attacked his FBI director, his CIA director, and his director of national intelligence, Dan Coats. Senator Schumer's letter to Dan Coats ended this way. The president is putting you and your colleagues in an untenable position and hurting the national interest in the process. You must find a way to make that clear to him. And here is the picture today of Dan Coats trying to, as Chuck Schumer put it, make that clear to the president, to educate the president. That meeting was demanded by Chuck Schumer. Much has been written, perhaps most authoritatively in Bob Woodward's book, about just how uneducable President Trump is. Sources inside the White House have told Woodward and others that it is impossible to educate the president. And much of the public knows that. And Senator Schumer's letter seems to deliberately play off of that public knowledge that the president cannot be educated. The president proved that once again today with his report on the meeting in which Dan Coats and the director of the CIA, Gina Haspel, tried to educate him. Just concluded a great meeting with my intel team in the Oval Office, who told me that what they said on Tuesday at the Senate hearing was mischaracterized by the media, and we are very much in agreement on Iran, ISIS, North Korea, etc. Their testimony was distorted. It is theoretically possible to mischaracterize and distort what happened in a Senate hearing, and that is why the Senate keeps transcripts of all of their hearings, and almost every Senate hearing is recorded on video, and so you can always check what was really said. But there is no video recording of the president's meeting in the Oval Office today. There is no transcript of it. But you can be absolutely sure that the president is mischaracterizing the meeting when he says that the intelligence directors told him that their testimony was mischaracterized by the media. Their testimony was not mischaracterized by the media. It was shown by the media on video. And so you got to see just how wrong the intelligence directors say the president of the United States is.
ISIS is intent on resurging and still commands thousands of fighters in Iraq and Syria.
And we have won against ISIS. We've beaten them, and we've beaten them badly.
We've all seen President Trump tell the world that he believes Vladimir Putin and that Russia did not attack our democratic process in the 2016 presidential election.
He just said it's not Russia. I will say this. I don't see any reason why it would be.
The reason why it would be is that everyone in the American intelligence community has told President Trump repeatedly that Russia did it. Russia is guilty. Russia attacked our campaign processes in 2016. And yesterday, the president's FBI director said Russia is still doing it.
Not only have the Russians continued to do it in 2018, but we've seen indication that they're continuing to adapt their model.
The president also tweeted today that after that meeting today, he said, I would suggest you read the complete testimony from Tuesday. A false narrative is so bad for our country. I value our intelligence community. Happily, we had a very good meeting, and we are all on the same page. Here's a page that no one else in the world is on, except Donald Trump. There is no longer a nuclear threat from North Korea. For Dan Coats and the other leaders of our intelligence community to be on the same page with Donald Trump, they would have to have said to him today, in that intervention you saw in the Oval Office, that there is no longer a nuclear threat from North Korea. Here's what Dan Coats said to the Senate about that on Tuesday.
We currently assess that North Korea will seek to retain its WMD capabilities and is unlikely to completely give up its nuclear weapons and production capabilities because its leaders ultimately view nuclear weapons as critical to regime survival.
So what are you going to believe? What Dan Coats said in public to the United States Senate, or what Donald Trump claims Dan Coats said to him in private in the Oval Office? Leading off our discussion now, Democratic Congressman Eric Swalwell from California. He's a member of the Intelligence and Judiciary Committees. And Jason Johnson, politics editor at TheRoot.com and an MSNBC contributor. Congressman Swalwell, first of all, the president's characterization of this meeting today in the Oval Office, in which the only source we have on this is the president, no transcript, no video. And he's saying that the intelligence chiefs came in there and said to him, we didn't say any of those things that are now on video that we've all seen them say.
Well, good evening, Lawrence. So telling is that the president did not watch that hearing, which I and so many others watched to learn about are worldwide threats, because if he had watched, he would have seen that they laid out the threats that we face. What is most concerning, though, is that the threats that the president believes face us are phantom threats, and he's putting up walls to protect against them. And those walls on the southern border would only divide us and destroy the symbol of America of being welcoming. But he's not allowing us to have the walls that we need for our true threats, the walls of a cyber defense against Russia, the walls of an alliance of NATO to counter any threat from Russia or other countries, the walls that we would need economically to take on China. The president, has us afraid of threats that are not there, and it turns us against each other, and we are almost defenseless against emerging threats that could truly destroy us economically and security-wise.
Jason Johnson, let's listen to something that Nancy Pelosi said today about this conflict between the president and the intelligence chiefs.
The president just doesn't seem to have the attention span or the desire to hear what the intelligence community has been telling him. So for him to make the statement that he did yesterday, that's cause for concern.
Jason Johnson, I was on the Hill today, and I have been given every reason to believe that this language is being very carefully chosen by Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer. Nancy Pelosi, they're using the phrase attention span. Chuck Schumer using the phrase educate him, because they believe that the public believes that the president does not have the attention span, and it is impossible to educate him.
Low IQ, low energy, attention span. Apparently no one just wants to say stupid, because that's really what they're saying. They want to say that they really believe that the President of the United States is too stupid and too undisciplined to follow the basic rules and guidance and advice that's coming from the security chiefs after he has spent the last 2 years and most of his presidency attacking them. But Lawrence, what I find more disturbing, and this is a consistent thing about this president, is his penchant for lying. His penchant that even when it can be proven that he is lying, even when someone is speaking to him, even when he has been proven to be incorrect, he'll just spin the story. He's a guy who could be in the pits of hell and say, yeah, I told him to turn the heat up and I like pitchforks, right? Like, it doesn't matter what people tell him. And that's what's most disturbing, because it doesn't just send a dangerous message to all of the national security people that we work with, but it sends a dangerous message to all of our allies abroad, that this president, when you talk to him, can't be trusted to not only leak information to possibly Russia and then to China, but also he will mischaracterize your conversation in ways that could be dangerous to intelligence gathering around the world.
Congressman Swalwell, I want to get your reaction to some of the other things the president said to the New York Times tonight. One being that he's basically just given up on the negotiations with Congress about funding the wall.
Yeah, he called the wall talks a waste of time. And actually, Lawrence, only an authoritative figure would think that collaboration and, God forbid, Republicans and Democrats sorting out border security would be a waste of time. I know in Washington, oftentimes governance is about theater than, policy. And there has been an obsession over Donald Trump getting schooled in the art of the deal, and that probably happened. But the truth is, governance is about testing ideas, and the idea of a wall was tested, and it failed because it's just a bad, ineffective idea. The idea of using a shutdown to get around the legislative process was tested. It failed because it hurts people, and it's a bad idea. Democracy is a great idea, and if we use it, we can make sure that government helps people in their everyday lives. And I think Donald Trump is going to learn that the hard way.
And Jason, I'll get a quick reaction to you from the New York Times reporting where President Trump attacks Elizabeth Warren, does the vicious stuff and uses the slurs, and but then in the same interview tries to say and does say positive things about Kamala Harris.
Yes, in addition to still not being able to pronounce Senator Harris's name correctly. Look, it's very obvious that the president is concerned about running against Elizabeth Warren in the same way that he was concerned about running against Hillary Clinton. Not that this in any way slights Senator Harris, but he doesn't necessarily think she's a concern. But also remember, Lawrence, he puts it in terms of pageantry. He's like, she had the best first act. She had the best performance. I don't think this man realizes that elections have consequences, and that even if he sees this as a reality show, that show may result in him getting canceled in 2020 if his ratings don't look better than Harris's or Warren's or Booker's or anybody else who runs.
Congressman Eric Swalwell, Jason Johnson, thank you both for joining us tonight. Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.